Well, in many ways, there are two sides of the same coin, globalization and demographics. So in the world before World War II, if you did not have oil and steel, or oil and iron ore and coal and food, the chances were that you were a colony, because you certainly didn't have the strength to challenge an empire. But with globalization, you only needed one of the four, and you could trade for the other three. And so we all started industrializing, we all started urbanizing, from the different starting points and at different paces, but we all started down the same path. You fast forward that a while, and it changes how national economics work. Because when you live on a subsistence farm, kids are free labor, you have a whole bunch of them. But when you live in town with an industrial job, you're probably living in a condo, and then kids are really expensive habits. And adults aren't stupid, so we had fewer of them. You play that forward 75 years, and we've had a massive demographic shift in the wider world. It started out when a lot of these countries had a lot of people that were young, in their 20s and their 30s, back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And that generated all the labor you could have possibly wanted and all the consumption you could have wanted. But they kept aging. Nobody was having kids. And by the time you got to the 2000s and the 2010s, we had a lot of cultures that had a lot of people in their late 40s to early 60s, so were rich, but there wasn't anyone to consume the stuff they produced, so they had to export it. What's happening this decade is a lot of countries are moving from that mature worker phase to mass retirement. And we don't have an economic model for what happens when you don't have workers of any age or consumers of any age. And so we know that the German system, the Chinese system, the Korean system, the Italian system, the Japanese system is going to end as we understand it this decade. And with globalization breaking down because of the failure of demographics, the only reason it might survive is if you get a large country with a huge navy and a lot of 20, 30-somethings to share everything with everyone, and that would have to be the United States. But we now have had 3 presidents in a row that have gotten progressively more nationalistic and populist in economic matters, with Biden being the most populist economic leader we have ever had. And betting that Biden or Trump or someone like either of them will continue to choose to sublimate American economic success in order to preserve the Chinese system, that's a bit of a reach.
I guess in the current environment, I mean, it's obviously exacerbated by all of the other factors that have given us inflation with a capital I in current times.
Sure.
Obviously, I have to imagine that this isolationist stance can only exacerbate.
Absolutely. I would argue that the majority of the inflation we're experiencing right now is actually rooted in the labor situation. The baby boomers, which are the largest cadre, just not in the United States, but globally, are all retiring. On average, they retire actually before the end of the year. So we are well past the peak. We're on a downward slope now. And that means we have lost not just the capacity to produce goods in mass, but also to generate the capital that's necessary to keep the entire system running, whether that's for credit card debt or borrowing to build an aircraft carrier battle group. The cost of capital everywhere is going up pretty sharply right now. This is not a one-off. This is not the Federal Reserve. This is demographic. This is people moving into retirement and taking their capital with them, liquidating their stocks and bond portfolios and going into much more conservative, low-risk things like T-bills and cash. This was always going to happen. Now it is happening. So we have a capital crunch, a consumption crunch, and a production crunch all at the same time. On top of that is the political impulse for greater control over our own economic destinies. You can call it mercantilist, you can call it nationalist or populist, it really doesn't matter. We're all looking at different interpretations of the same thing. What it is popular. The Biden administration is in the process of firing the starting gun, if you will, on doubling the size of the American industrial plant, because we're going to need that in a world where China and Germany cannot function in the way we've become used to it. But yes, that means that in our constrained labor environment, we have to employ a lot more people. And that means that inflation has nowhere to go but up for a very long period of time, at least 5 years.
What about immigration as a substitute for birth rate? Like, is that a way that we can get around? Maybe we have a few pro-immigration nations around the world that could create a younger workforce just through policy?
In the mid to long term, that is absolutely true, but in the short term, it's not possible. So 2 things here. Number one, our single largest source of migration for the last 50 years has been Mexico. But Mexico started down the road towards industrialization and urbanization just like everybody else. They just started later. They started in the early 90s. Well, the early 90s was 30 years ago, which means that Mexico's birth rate halved about 25 years ago and never recovered. So net migration from Mexico to the United States has actually been negative for 12 of the last 13 years, and I doubt it's ever going to recover. So our normal one-stop shop is gone. That means we have to go to the Eastern Hemisphere and recruit. And that means we need a conscious, congressionally mandated immigration policy, because we can't just pretend that there's no immigration and leave the southern border open. People actually have to get here from a different hemisphere. The problem we're facing right now is we're also going through a political transition in the United States. Every generation or so, we have enough accrued changes to our system, either through changes in culture or technology or geopolitics, that the factions that make up our parties move around. The last big time it went down was in the 1930s. We had the Great Depression, we had World War II, and before that transition, big business were all Democrats, and African Americans were all Republicans. They switched. What's going on today is we're in a tug of war between the Democrats and the Republicans over who gets organized labor. And the issue that organized labor cares about the most is immigration. So no one at the national level from either party wants to touch migration whatsoever until our internal political placement is settled. That's not going to happen in the next year or two. We're probably looking at having to wait until the next presidential election, not 2024, 2028. So we are missing a wonderful opportunity right now while all of the world is in flux and people are looking for a place to land, and it's just not going to be here for a bit yet.
So on that, do you have any concerns about the future of democracy?
For the United States, I'm not overly concerned. We go through these phases, like I said, every generation or two, and part of the reason why it seems so dire is that the parties themselves are breaking down, and this has happened 6 times before. We will get through this. It's just that it's a 5 to 10 year process, and we're like year 6 of it right now. So unfortunately, we still have some time to go, and you add in social media, and we're all screaming at one another. And with Elon taking over Twitter, what content moderation there was is now gone, and I think everybody has noticed that in their own feeds, a lot of the crazy is back, which is very unfortunate in my opinion. But we will get through this. Why do I think we will get through this? Because we had 8 years of a failed presidency under Obama, and we got through it. We had 4 years of a failed presidency under Trump, and we got through it. Now we have Biden, who lots of people have lots of opinions. I don't think he's anyone's favorite. But compared to the last 2 people, he's great because he's actually trying to be president. You might not like his policies, but he actually shows up to work and talks to people, which is something the last 2 didn't do. So I would actually argue that we were well on our way to coming out. And if you look at the midterms, the American preference for rotating